Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. I am out of town today, so this program was pre-recorded for broadcast at this time. I do think you'll find the topic to be very interesting. Are you familiar with what an electromagnetic pulse is? It's more commonly referred to by the acronym EMP, and there are several ways an EMP can happen. But the one that poses the most serious threat is one created by the detonation of a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere. Authorities have known for decades that such an attack would probably kill 90% of all Americans. But we have done almost nothing to harden our infrastructure against it, and we are woefully unprepared for it to happen. Well, there are a few ways to learn about EMPs and their destructive aftermath, but the most interesting and entertaining way is to read about them. Not in a textbook or a scientific journal, but in a fictitious but scientifically fact-based novel. William R. Forstchen wrote a 3-book trilogy on the subject. I have read all 3, and I interviewed him about all 3. He published the first book titled 1 Second After in 2009. The second book, titled 1 Year After, was published in 2015. And the last book, titled The Final Day, was published in 2017. All 3 are still available for purchase wherever books are sold. On today's show, I will play the interviews I did with Bill Forstchen for his first 2 books, each done in the year the book was released. We won't have time to play the interview about the 3rd book, but that's just fine, because quite honestly, although the first 2 books were outstanding, and I highly recommend that you read them, the 3rd and final book was, well, how can I say this best? He should have stopped with the sequel and not made it a trilogy. So let's listen to those 2 interviews now. This is Mike Bates. I've got with me on the line William Forstchen. He is a book author who wrote the book titled 1 Second After. Appreciate you joining us.
I'm with you today.
This book, 1 Second After, the foreword is written by former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, and the book is about an electronic Armageddon, if you will, where there's an electromagnetic pulse that destroys the electrical circuits in the United States, essentially throwing us back into the pre-industrial days of having no electricity. And I read this book in its entirety, Bill, and I want you to know that. A lot of times when a radio host is doing a book interview with the author, they haven't read the book. They might have read the sleeve, and they might have thumbed through it. I read every word of this book and was captivated. It's a phenomenal read.
That's high praise indeed. Thank you. That's a great way to start the show for me. Appreciate it.
And I will, I don't want to spend the whole time talking about the book, because I want to talk about the concept, too, of the electromagnetic pulse. But let me just begin by saying this. The aspect of the book that I liked best was that when John Matterson and the others were making decisions about what they were going to do, you took the time to go into the discussion as to why they should do that or why they shouldn't and what the consequences of each would be. And I loved that aspect of the book.
What you're raising is the fact that there were a lot of people behind me when I wrote this book. Just to explain quickly to your listeners, EMP stands for electromagnetic pulse. It's the byproduct of detonating a nuclear weapon that 200 miles out in space. In that first millionth of a second, the gamma ray burst coming off the bomb hits the upper atmosphere, triggers an electromagnetic disturbance, sort of like a pebble rolling downhill and triggering an avalanche. And when that hits the surface of the Earth, it can be as high as thousands of volts per square meter. Now that feeds into all of the power lines, all of our electrical systems, and again, in that first millionth of a second or 1 second after, it overloads the entire grid and blows it out. So bang, it's a game ender.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started working on the book, I spent about a year doing research and thinking and some false starts and such. And I'm a college professor in a small town up here in the mountains of North Carolina. And I was sitting in a graduation ceremony, and it was suddenly smack up the side of my head. I'm looking at my kids, I'm looking at the parents and neighbors and friends, and I suddenly realized, what happens to us?
Mm-hmm.
Don't do some Tom Clancy. I like Tom Clancy, but rather than write about superheroes running around saving the world, what happens in a typical small town? So the point is, I went from there. I interviewed my chief of police, director of public safety, the pharmacist, the nurse in the nursing home where my father was, and they became, in a sense, real people. In fact, every one of the characters in the book, except for the chief of police, is actually based on a real person.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that was part of what made the book so fascinating, is that it wasn't a story about Mitch Rapp or Jack Ryan or any superhero like you described. This was just a small town professor from Black Mountain, North Carolina, in the western part of the state, who all of a sudden his ceiling fan wasn't turning anymore. And the story develops, and I mean, I don't want to say I was frightening, like hiding under the bed sheets shaking, but it was frightening because this is not fantasy. This could really happen, right?
Yes. This is definitely not fantasy, and that's one of the problems with getting the word out about the true threat of EMP. I bet at least one of your listeners is thinking, gosh, he rounded up a guy that's wearing a tinfoil hat today. It sounds like sci-fi, doesn't it?
Well,
and think about how most movies portray, even if they touch on EMP. It's like, oh, we'll turn the power off for 30 seconds, or in War of the Worlds, oh, just change the solenoid in your car and it'll be okay again. This is a very real threat that we've known about since the 1960s, and we're not prepared for it.
Why aren't we prepared for it?
Well, we got to go back a bit into history for 30 seconds. Okay, I'm 59. When I was a kid growing up in New York City during the Cold War, it was all about fail-safe, Dr. Strangelove, 1,000 nuclear weapons hit us, we hit them. But in 1962, both we and the Soviets popped a missile up into space, and it really was a bit like kids playing with firecrackers. Let's see how big the bang is. What happens? Our particular launch you can find on the internet. It's called Starfish Prime. They pop a nuke 500 miles away from Hawaii and 200 miles straight up, and it blew out a fair part of the power grid of the Hawaiian Islands. Right about the same time the Soviets did it over Kazakhstan, they blew out a fair part of their power grid over their own country.
Mm-hmm. Was that expected?
No. They knew about what's called the Compton effect, and that's another thing folks can look up, but they didn't expect the intensity. So anyhow, back in those bad old days, we had what was called mutual assured destruction. We said to the Soviets, if you hit us, we'll hit you. Nobody wins.
Right.
End of game. Well, we're in a different world today. Suppose you have, definitely by our definition, a psycho ruler who says that if he kills the great Satan, their Mati comes out of a well and gives everybody 70 girlfriends.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter whether we live or die, meaning the people who are doing this. All you need is one or two small nuclear weapons to achieve it. Now, how do we stop that?
Right, and the ability to elevate it.
Exactly.
Because an EMP, if, for example, it was exploded, say, 200 meters above the Earth as opposed to 200 miles, there would still be an EMP, but wouldn't everything be pretty much fried anyway?
Yeah, well, what you're talking about is a line-of-sight event. If somebody pops a bomb 200 meters up, well, you're inside the blast zone in terms of line-of-sight event. So the horizon is maybe about 10, 12 miles away, 15 at that point. You need to get it above the Earth's atmosphere to create the full devastating effect, which means you need a missile, and the Iranians and the North Koreans both have them. Now, the Iranians, for years, have been taking barges out into the Caspian Sea and shooting rockets straight up 200 miles.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's only one military application to that. Let's consider putting a container ship somewhere off your coast to Florida or Louisiana or Texas, and you lost one up over the middle of the United States. Not enough time to shoot it down, not enough warning or anything. End of game. And here's the scary statistic. 90% of all Americans might very well be dead a year later.
Oh, and your book plays it out paragraph by paragraph of exactly how that would occur. Oh, heck, I've got plenty of canned goods in the refrigerator. I've got them in the pantry. Oh, I'm a survivalist. I got plenty of stuff buried in the backyard. Well, you know, some of the people in your book did too. But it's a lot more than just finding food, isn't it?
Well, okay, where you are right now, when you got up this morning, where did you get your water from?
Came out of the faucet, which is no doubt because I've got a water tower that is giving it to me from gravity, but something's pulling it up, and I would imagine that's electricity.
Yeah, I mean, in our 21st century world, some of us think it just magically appears out of the faucet. There's a complex infrastructure behind that, starting from a river or an artesian well or whatever. All of it needs electricity. Well, what happens where you live if all of the water in your town shuts down?
Well, here on the Gulf Coast, we've got plenty of salt water, but we'd have to desalinate that somehow. And desalination was done during the Civil War pre-electricity. They had these giant vats that they would burn, and they would evaporate the water. Well, actually, it wasn't so much desalination as it was getting the salt, but there are ways to capture that evaporated moisture and desalinate the water, but not for 500,000 people.
And then we do the cascading effect. No water. Okay, food. Now, let's say it's summertime down there in Florida. How long is the food in your house going to keep when there's no AC, no electricity, no refrigeration? Typical town, at most, has about 3 weeks' worth of food, either in the pantry, in the supermarket, or in a truck coming to a store near you. Once that runs out, where does your food come from? Then where does the medication come from? Where do so many things come from? Yeah. That's the die-off.
Yeah, and I obviously don't want to give away the plot, but one of the daughters in the book has diabetes and is insulin dependent, and that plays a pretty common theme throughout of how that medicine is obtained, how long it is kept, and what happens.
Okay, Bill, you presented us with this terrible scenario. What happens? Well, we can talk about the politics later, but on the most fundamental level, you guys living in Florida know you've got to be prepared to be able to hang on for your own for at least a couple of weeks. But think as a community. I mean, I live in a little cove up here in the mountains. I know my neighbors. We know who we can rely on. We know which skills we got. It's the nature of living in a small town. Even if you live in a big city, you can be doing the same thing. But how much better are our chances if 10 or 15 of us team together and pool our resources? The way it used to be done on the frontier 150, 200 years ago.
Yeah, see, what makes Florida unique with our hurricanes is that we are prepared for being without power. Now, eventually, the Gulf Power truck and the visiting utility crews are going to come down our street and they're going to restore our power, and it may be a day, it may be a month, but it's coming back. But in the meantime, somebody has driven a truck in with food and ice and water and supplies and medicine. The commerce has not come to a screeching halt. Yeah, we're inconvenienced. Yeah, it's hot as heck. Yeah, we're miserable. But the neighboring community that didn't get hit has an 18-wheeler stocked with necessary life-sustaining supplies, and they just drive in down the interstate. Bill Forstchen, in the case of an EMP, that neighboring community, that 18-wheeler ain't driving, is it?
Well, you hit on one of the inspiration points. My father was in a nursing home when I started working on this book, and I lost him shortly thereafter. We got hit by a hurricane. Came out of Florida. It dumped 30 inches of rain up here, blew the whole infrastructure out in one day. And late that evening, I was on an emergency supply line getting water for the nursing home. And it actually started getting a little bit ugly when I asked for 50 gallons. And having explained the hows and the whys, and afterwards I talked with my chief, and I was like, Chief, if this had been real and there had been no more trucks coming, would you have given me the 50 gallons? And he's like, God, Bill, I don't even want to answer that question.
Right.
And he said, maybe out of Christian charity, I'd have given you 5, 8 gallons, but then I'd have to triage them off.
Exactly. And that's what this book does. 1 second after, they go into the decisions that are made during that triage, and it really is a fascinating read.
Thank you.
It wasn't so much that I'm saying that the book is a survivalist guide. It's not that. It's almost a matter of tempering it. This is not a survivalist guide. This is not an end-of-the-world, prepare yourself for Armageddon type book in the sense that the conspiracy theorist believes about to happen. This book, in a very calm, reasonable, and fictional account, very well written, action-packed, and just in-depth decision-making, in a very calm, reasonable manner, went into what could very well occur, and in doing so, it gave you that guide you needed. It was a fantastic book. The book is 1 second after. I've got to take a break, but Bill Forstchen is going to be able to stay with us through the break. So we're going to take a break now. When we get back, we'll have a few minutes left with him. And we'll talk a little bit more about his book, which I really do encourage you to read. It's titled 1 Second After. His name again, Bill Forstchen, and it's Forstchen. And our conversation with Bill Forstchen will continue in just a moment. Welcome back. This is Mike Bates, and with me on the line is Bill Forstchen. He is the author of the book 1 Second After. It's a book about an electromagnetic pulse that takes out the electrical system of the United States and throws us back into the early 19th century, and it's a good read, and I encourage you to read it. Now, Bill, let me ask you this question, though. The electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear weapon clearly would destroy the electrical grid, but the sun emits electromagnetic radiation all the time, so what's the big difference?
I would urge folks, look up something called the Carrington event. Major solar storm, 1859, blew out the Victorian internet, meaning the telegraphy system. A major solar storm creates an ejected mass. It's an ion-charged mass that, if it hits the Earth, sets up this almost, not quite identical, but almost the identical kind of electromagnetic disturbance. It looks cool when it's just the northern lights, but a really, really big one could do the same thing, blow out our power grid. We're overdue for one. They hit about an average of every 75 to 100 years.
Well, and on a lesser scale, satellites, which are beyond the atmospheric protection, could very well be vulnerable to something a whole lot less than the EMP that you describe in your book 1 Second After.
Well, actually, they put those babies up there and they harden them like crazy because they are exposed to a lot more direct solar radiation. But yes, a major, major event could blow all that out as well.
Well, now that brings up an interesting question. You say they've hardened the satellites, and I've seen enough stories on the History Channel and such about Air Force One that Air Force One supposedly is hardened against an EMP. So we have the technology to do it. Why haven't we done it?
Cost. Hey, cost and profit and everything else. Believe me, I am a conservative capitalist. Yet, quick analogy. You got a daughter, you're going to go out and buy a car, and you say, look, just pull out the airbags, the steel frame, the collapsible steering column. Let's get rid of all this safety crap. I can save $2,000. What kind of father are you?
Mm-hmm.
Would you buy a house without insurance? Hardening the infrastructure is putting an insurance policy on our very survival, and the cost per citizen would run most likely hundreds of dollars per citizen.
Mm-hmm.
But do you want to gamble with that?
Well, it's something that's going to have to be done over time. You clearly can't make it all happen in a year, but the time to start is now.
It'll take 5 to 10 years.
Right. So what should we do? I mean, what can we do? I've read the book, and I've read even other sources. You're not the only source of my knowledge about EMP, although your book was certainly the most interesting that I've read about it. But if this does exist, what can we do to get the politicians to do something to harden this country and to defend ourselves from what could be a catastrophic attack?
Well, I always try to do this in a 30-second soundbite. There are 3 things. 1, and we've already talked about the first 2. You, as an individual and a family, should be prepared to be able to get by on your own, perhaps for an extended period of time. 2, community. Get to work with your neighbors, know what your neighbors, know who you can rely on, and shared skills. Number 3 is political. There is no constituency. My great heroes in this are Congressman Benny Thompson out of Mississippi and Congressman Roscoe Bartlett out of Maryland. I've gotten to know Roscoe Bartlett, and he says it all the time. He says, Bill, there is no constituency. If like 50 voters per congressman called up and said, EMP is a serious issue I wanted addressed, it would be on the docket, and we would have the funding moving to start hardening our infrastructure.
It's unfortunate it would take that because every congressman either knows or should know that the threat exists, and it shouldn't require the citizens having a grassroots effort. I mean, if that's what it takes, then fine, let's do it. But it is highly irresponsible of those in power and in the position to do something about a threat, not a threat that's unknown. You know, if you're sucker punched, then, oh, well, you know, you didn't know. But the fact that this threat is real and we're doing little to nothing about it is a real problem. Bill Forstchen, and I want to spell that last name for you, Forstchen, the title of the book, 1 Second After. It's available at bookstores still and, of course, online. And don't you have a website too, Bill?
Yeah, it's 1secondafter.com.
Oh, that's easy to remember. Okay, 1secondafter.com. And you can order that book, 1 Second After. And I tell you, from having read the story myself, I can tell you it is a fantastic novel. I mean, never mind that you're going to learn something. Even if you just want the pure entertainment, It's a well-written book, but if you do want the knowledge that comes from the way he presents it, I highly, highly recommend the book 1 Second After by Bill Forstchen. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. I am out of town today, so this program was pre-recorded for broadcast at this time. Those previous two segments were an interview I did in 2009 with William R. Forstchen about his book 1 Second After. This segment, and the next one, will be our interview from 2015 about his sequel titled 1 Year After. Here we go. This is Mike Bates. We talk about EMP on this radio station a fair amount. That's electromagnetic pulse. It is a real threat that faces this country, and it's something that nobody seems to really be doing anything about. The public is largely ignorant of it, and the politicians are largely apathetic. And there was an outstanding book written in 2009 by William R. Forstchen titled 1 Second After. I read it then. I talked to him then on this very radio station and have recommended the book countless times since. Well, he has now issued a new book titled 1 Year After, and I'm pleased to welcome William R. Forstchen back to the airwaves.
Sir, it's a pleasure to be with you again.
Well, I greatly appreciate you joining us. Before we get into the details on this book, can you give us a quick explanation of what an electromagnetic pulse is?
Sure. EMP for short stands for electromagnetic pulse. It is generated by detonating a small fission bomb, a small nuclear device, approximately 200 to 250 miles above the Earth's atmosphere. When detonated above the Earth's atmosphere, when the gamma rays from the bomb start hitting that upper atmosphere, they break loose electrons from the nitrogen and oxygen. That sets up a static discharge, which is not unlike, the lightning bolt hitting next to your house or scuffing around in wool socks and then touching your computer. However, this one is potent. As it descends down to the Earth's surface at the speed of light, it keeps building up in intensity, and when it strikes, every single wire out there, from the power pole to all your high-tension lines, absorb that electrical overload, blows through the grid, short-circuits everything out. The entire grid goes down. The perfect nightmare storm would be an enemy detonating 3 small fission bombs over the eastern, middle, and western United States. It would take the power grid of America offline. And then, according to the congressional study, 90% of all Americans would be dead within a year. 90%.
And the book, 1 Second After, explained that. And it was such a good book, and it's the reason I've recommended it so many times since 2009 to people, is because even though the book is fiction, obviously it hasn't happened, it's fiction, it's written in such a way that the truth comes alive without it being sci-fi. You know, this is not science fiction fantasy. This was a shocking book about the reality of living in a nation without electricity. And an EMP has the capability of knocking the United States literally back to the pre-industrial agrarian era where we frankly can't survive anymore.
You got it. To give just a touch more background, I was in Washington, D.C. on the day the 2004 report was released. A friend of mine that had attended that meeting expressed rage that there was zero public reaction, zero media coverage, because by coincidence it was the same day as the 9/11 report. The following day, I went in to visit the chairman of the committee, Congressman Roscoe Bartlett, used to be representative out of Maryland. And he hit it on the head. He said, Bill, there's no constituency. It sounds like science fiction, like you just said. Or it's so poorly represented in films and movies, people don't take it seriously. So some of your listeners might be thinking, where the heck did this guy come up with a 90% casualty rate? Well, let me ask you right now. You're in the Pensacola area. Where does your water supply come from?
In this area, it mostly comes from wells that require electricity to pump.
Precisely. Almost every city in America becomes uninhabitable within seconds because the water reserve. Then point two, I would almost call it Maslow's hierarchy of destruction. First of all, no water supply. Second, the average city only has 20 to 25 days worth of food on hand. When that's gone, it's gone. Your pharmacies, they are literally day after. I just called a prescription in a couple days ago to my pharmacy, and they said, well, we don't have on the shelf, but it will be back in tomorrow. So all of us depended on various kinds of medications, and many with life situations, or even consider pain management. All of that's gone. Command and control goes down. How does the police and fire departments and our emergency personnel respond? All of this adds up to the greatest catastrophe in the history of humanity. It would be worse than the 14th century Great Plague, which wiped out about a third to a half of the European population.
Well, here in Pensacola, we periodically get hurricanes, and it knocks out our power. But there is no comparison, because as miserable as it is until power is restored, and that is, by the way, when life returns to normal, is when power is restored. So this neighborhood that gets power, their life is now more or less back to normal. The next door neighbor that doesn't have power, their life is still not yet back to normal. But the big difference between losing electrical power in a hurricane and losing it in an EMP, there's multiple things. Number one, there are assets, there are relief supplies that are set up just beyond the catastrophe area of the hurricane. And so once the hurricane passes, those assets drive in those relief supplies. Secondly, there are generators in the critical infrastructure to keep electricity going. And thirdly, the equipment is without electricity. It's not destroyed. With an EMP, you don't have any of those three things.
And let us add that I can recall even something as catastrophic as Katrina, which reached as far as you. I teach at a small Christian college up here in North Carolina. Within 24 hours, we had a large truckload of supplies going down to a church down in the New Orleans area to help. Help came in from all across the nation. Every one of our catastrophes, a terrible earthquake in California or Sandy a couple of years ago, when you get right down to it, it's a localized disaster, and the rest of the country comes rallying in to help. Suppose the entire nation goes down. Who's going to help us? Where's the help going to come from?
Well, that's just it.
It's not. And then how do you rebuild? It's not just the generating systems themselves. The real vulnerability is all those hundreds of thousands of miles of high-tension lines. They just explode. So even if a generator survives, how does the energy get, say, from Charlotte, North Carolina to Asheville, or from Pensacola to some neighboring town 30 miles away? It doesn't. And it will not come back on.
And pretty much everything we have is dependent upon electricity. Even the cars we drive. In the book 1 Second After, it was an Edsel, because it was an older car that didn't have computer chips. So there's this Edsel that managed to make it around town. But all the modern cars, they're fried. And you can't just replace the circuit board because the distribution network is down, and so are the factories.
I recall doing a radio show a couple of years back. It was in the D.C. area, in which somebody challenged the percentage estimate that upwards of 90% of all cars would be cooked offline. And the person was going on, it wouldn't be all that bad. Maybe 5, 10, 15% of the cars would die. And to which I replied, do you commute on the Beltway every day? And I was like, yeah. And I said, if 5% of the cars died on the Beltway, what happens to the other 95%? The person went, yeah, you're right. Everything's down.
Yeah, I mean, even if you could push them off the side of the road, that's still, you wouldn't have the pumps at the gas station. That requires electricity.
Right.
Gasoline is not gravity fed.
You got a cascading series of disasters. When I was researching the book, the shocker for me was Congressman Bartlett asked me to write a novel to try and raise public awareness. I never anticipated it was going to turn into New York Times bestsellers. But then when I started interviewing people, law enforcement officials, the one that really shocked me was the nursing home director and the pharmacist. In both of those interviews, the people I was talking to broke down and started, they were in tears after an hour of, my God, Bill, we never thought about these things. And you recall from my book 1 Second After, I did write a nursing home scene in. because at the time I was writing the book, my father was still with us. He was fighting out the last months of his life as a cavalry trooper from World War II, tough old guy, but his time was up. And in the nursing home, they said, within 48 hours, we'll lose almost half the people here.
And Jennifer needed insulin. Now, I don't want to say what happened to Jennifer because I want people to read both the new book, 1 year after, and the old book, 1 second after. And Jennifer's situation is addressed in 1 second after, so I won't go into what happened to her. But she needed insulin.
Mm-hmm.
And that required refrigeration.
Precisely. And a friend of mine actually had a heart transplant a year ago. He's doing great. He's a fellow professor at my college. And we were just talking the other day, and he said, you know, Bill, the book does scare the hell out of me. Because if it ever happened, I'd be gone in a month.
No question about it. Now, if the nuclear weapon were to be detonated over the continental United States, what would happen to the military assets that the United States has around the world? Would they then come home? How would that work?
Excellent question. You're really hitting me with some great questions. I really appreciate it because, first of all, let's look at delivery against us. It could be done very low-tech, very simple. Cargo container ship with a low-grade Scud missile and a 40-kiloton warhead atop, which all are things that Iran either has or shortly will have, lofted up. So in the book 1 second after, towards the end, I have somebody, we'll not get into too many details on that, but somebody from outside the community of Black Mountain, North Carolina says, oh gosh, yeah, the Iranians did it to us and we turned most of their country into glass. We retaliated. To which my main character says back, does that change anything here? Mm-hmm. Does that bring back the tens of thousands of people just in my community area who have died? We've got to realize we're dealing with suicidal regimes. Regimes like Iran, regimes like North Korea, controlled by a psychotic. As to our military assets, yes, the overseas assets would be intact, and chances are we would have to abandon our positions around the world to try and bring our military back here to bring some semblance of order, but then what happens to global stability? We're talking about what eventually would cascade into a global crisis.
And the new book, 1 year after, kind of does address that. We've got to take a quick commercial break, but when we get back, we're going to continue our conversation with William R. Forstchen, the author of 1 year after, and also the book 1 second after, and I strongly recommend both. This is Mike Bates. With me on the phone is William R. Forstchen. He's the author of the book 1 year after, and the companion, the prequel, I guess, 1 second after, both outstanding books about the aftermath of an electromagnetic pulse attack on the United States. William, when I read 1 second after in 2009, what brought the book alive, at least to me, was that it wasn't just a narrative of what happened. A tremendous amount of that book went into the thought process of the decisions that were made by the individuals and by the surviving city council of Black Mountain. I think you did a great job on that. And then I heard you were coming out with a new book 1 year after, and I was wondering how you would make that interesting. Well, you did. It was a very, very good book.
You know, it's a book I didn't want to write. Let's warn your audience right now. This is not a fun, happy book. It is a sharp, realistic look at a definite threat to America. And it took a lot out of me. And I joked that I'd like to write a book called Happy Bunny Goes to Town someday. I wish we lived in a world where I could write books like that. I do not want this to happen. That's why I'm writing the book.
Well, I don't want it to happen either, which is why I'm promoting the book. And I wish the politicians would do something about it, because what 1 year after brought to life was the aftermath. Now, 1 second after lasted a full year. Okay, so 1 year after actually begins at day, I guess, 366. But
yes.
It speaks to the anarchy, it speaks to the tribalism, it speaks to the, frankly, warfare among Americans who are trying to survive, and then, in a very shocking manner, it speaks to the federal government's Army of National Recovery. What are they doing about it? And obviously we don't want to give away the whole plot of the book, but tell us a little bit about this Army of National Recovery that is imposed on the people of the United States in the aftermath of that EMP attack.
All right, well, we'll go in the political arena for 1 minute here. I am very frustrated
The book came out in 2009. I'm not the only person that has written about this issue. Others had. Let me promote Ted Koppel's book, which is a straightforward, not novelistic discussion of infrastructure, the vulnerability. And nothing is being done on the federal level. 2 bills called SHIELD Acts have gone through the House, and both times have been blocked in the Senate. I wrote 1 second after in 2009, my main intent was it's going to trigger some federal action. My friend Congressman Bartlett handed it to every single member of Congress. Nothing's been done. So I take the old kind of federalist view. Our founding fathers said a lot of power should rest with the states. And a number of states now are moving towards infrastructure upgrading to be able to withstand an EMP. And I pray that it becomes an issue. So yes, 1 year after picks up afterwards, this Army of National Recovery. Well, I might not say who I'm thinking about, but I'm thinking about the bureaucracies that were created after 9/11, and you wonder how effective they really are.
Yeah, not very. But as you say in your book, electricity was the fundamental bedrock of their entire civilization, so ubiquitous that no one really fully grasped how crucial it was until it was gone.
Correct.
And when it was gone, people didn't have food, they didn't have coffee, they didn't have cigarettes, they didn't have lighting, air conditioning, refrigeration. It was a mess. And the interesting part of this book that I saw was the localism, the tribalism that resulted. No longer were we really Americans, we were this community. And the one across the mountain, they were that community. And we were actually competing in many ways for the same resources.
I have an exceptional editor with Tor Forge Books, and we had a running debate for actually a couple of years that he wanted a broader view. And he finally agreed with me. I said, no, if the whole infrastructure goes down, we revert backwards in terms of communications 200 years immediately, which means the only thing you really know is as far as you can see and hear. When our great-great-grandparents went off to fight the American Civil War, the Revolution, as soon as that young man turned the bend in the road, you didn't know. You might never know again what happened to him. Think about how ubiquitous cell phones are to us. Every parent listening knows that if they can't reach their kid instantly, they start going into a panic attack if something happens.
Mm-hmm.
I have a daughter who has been studying overseas, and we speak on a daily basis. Think about that in terms of just how things were even just 50 or 75 years ago. So the breakdown in communications and the silence and the dead cell phones alone, it's going to have a major psychological impact and a societal impact.
Very much so. And what this book, 1 year after, goes into is how the federal government is dealing with it. And they classify each of the states, page 140 and 141, ratings each state from level 1, meaning fully stabilized, based on a number of criteria, down to a level 5, which means currently occupied either by a hostile nation or a nation claiming it is neutral and alleging it is here to help, to complete anarchy into lawlessness, of which Florida is the worst case, end quote. Why'd you pick Florida as the worst?
Florida. Well, I remember years ago there was an excellent article in American Heritage magazine, I'm a historian, which pointed out Florida basically would not exist if it wasn't for electricity. Because electricity means air conditioning, and secondly, insect control, which requires electricity as well in terms of transportation of insecticide and such.
Mm-hmm.
If you take those two things away, what happens to the vast majority of the area of Florida? It's uninhabitable. And the homes and the offices and all the cities that have been built there, uninhabitable.
Yeah, a valid point. I suppose we could fish, we could get that, but even that's not going to feed an entire state, even if 90% of the population dies in the first year after an EMP attack.
Well, I live up in the Smoky Mountains, and same thing. People go, oh, well, you can go out, you can hunt for deer and bear. And I'm going like, yeah, 100,000 people running around here with rifles within 1 week will deplete all that and be shooting each other as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So what I'm hoping people will do is read both your books, 1 second after and 1 year after, and become aware of the threat, not to cause panic, but to cause preparation. What's your objective here?
Oh, for heaven's sake, thank you for that one. Preparedness. I've given up on the federal government any effective response for perhaps several years to come. Hey, you're in Florida. Floridians know. Be ready to be able to hang on your own for a week or two. I want that message across the whole country. Start with just a week or two of preparedness, and then gradually build up. If you can hang on for a month or two or three. And the number one thing every household should have, a simple water filter that you can buy at a camping store for $20. That's the difference between drinking water or everybody in your family's down with gastrointestinal illnesses a week after an event like this starts.
Very good points. We've got to run here in 20 seconds, but I want to thank you for coming on. The title of the book, 1 Year After. The author is William R. Forstchen. That's Forstchen. You can find him online at www.onesecondafter.com. Outstanding books. I encourage you to read them. And William Forstchen, thanks so much for joining us.
God bless you and the United States.